Hey guys, what's up? How's it going? It's Nick here, or Troopa. I'm going to make a short video about my Naya Survival deck that you see in front of you, and I'm going to go through all the cards one by one and explain like how it all fits together into the unique weapon that it is. Premodern is a pretty dirtily format in my finding, and these aggressive survival decks do really well against the format. And I think I have a few things in this toolbox that makes this particular survival deck really hard to hate out. It's really resilient to hate. So, like, there's a lot of sideboard cards being played in the format that don't do anything against this. So I'm going to go and explain all of that. But currently I'm 5-0 in the Pod A of the Facebook monthly for the Premodern group. So I wanted to put some content out there about this deck because I think no one's really talking about it. You know, this is a rogue deck. I just built it. Everybody I played against is like, I've never played that. So I just want to put this out there so people know like why the cards are the way they are and that there's some thought process behind each and every one. It is a pretty tuned deck at this point. I was working on survival decks for a long time. Like I played a lot of Angry Tradewind Survival before building this deck. But this deck I think is much more powerful than ATS. So going into this is just an aggressive survival deck. You're always seeking to attack your opponent for damage. We're going to start by talking about Basking Rootwalla. And Basking Rootwalla is the foundation of this deck. The fact that you can madness it out for 0, it makes it a natural 4-of with Survival of the Fittest. It also isn't a terrible 1-drop. That may sound kind of extreme because it is kind of a weaker 1-drop, like in the format. But a lot of times you're going to end up in a game of attrition, and pumping a Rootwalla a couple of times can get you close enough to actually win a couple of games that you shouldn't have. But basically Rootwalla is there to chain out with Survival of the Fittest and combo with Gaea's Cradle, because once you make a bunch of Rootwallas, then you can tap your Cradle for a bunch more mana. So that's why you want the full 4, and you want to play at least 3 Gaea's Cradle. I think 4 is actually probably too many because you don't want multiples, and it's a tough card to have when you don't have creatures on the board and you need to tap it for mana. So the next card is Birds of Paradise, also one of like the backbone pieces of this deck, and one card that is different from Survival Elves. So note that all 8 of these cards are not in that deck. So Birds taps for any color of mana, which is really great. It has some uses with things like Enlightened Tutor, Flametongue Kavu, Monk Idealist, but to be honest, I might not need 4 birds. It does like cast Sideboard Pyroblasts, and it casts Goblin Sharpshooter, it casts Swords to Plowshares, and it accelerates. You know, it does that every time. So I would never cut birds, but it's not like at its best here. You know, it does combo with Gaea's Cradle, and I've never really like wanted to run 3, but I just thought I'd note that. You also need to run at least 2 Llanowar Elves so that you can more commonly have that turn 1 accelerant, because playing a turn 1 elf, Mana Dork, is the best thing this deck can do by far. And you want to do that as much as possible and as often as possible. So you want to play the full 6. Also, 2 Wall of Roots. I think this card is actually like such an all-star in this deck. It helps you pivot onto a board where they have like a creature to attack you. It doesn't even cost you mana because you can use it on both turns, your turn and their turn with survival activations. It just nets so much mana over the course of the game, and if you're wondering like what to do, like to set up your your sequence of plays, you often want to start with a Wall of Roots. Survival decks are notoriously tricky to play, and it's tough to play all the cards in the perfect order. Think about Wall of Roots as early as possible in your chain of play because it's very, very good. A lot of times your opponent will forget that you have like that activation on their turn to survival at the end of their turn, but you get that for free with Wall of Roots. That's why it's so great. So going right to a Monk Idealist, I don't want to talk about this card right yet. I just want to go to the next green cards, so we'll come back to the white cards. Going to the Blastoderms, I'm playing a full 4, and I don't regret it at all. This guy is just such a big beatstick, and it presents a really big problem. One that, like, what are they even going to do in Premodern? Like, they just have to wrath the board or have, like, chump blockers. Blastoderm is great here. It's not like they can, like, Diabolic Edict us, or I don't know. There's just not a lot of answers for Blastoderm in this format. Yeah, he has Fading, but a lot of the time, like, it doesn't end up mattering. So he's just a big 5/5 Shroud. which we really need. We need a lot of bulk, just in case we don't draw survival and like we run out of threats, say they duress us or something. We want to have enough like big creatures to actually be able to kill an opponent with good cards. So, moving right along, I'm going to go to these Flametongue Kavus right here. Now, Flametongue Kavu is such a strong card if you're playing against a deck that has targets for it. Against a lot of decks, Flametongue Kavu is coming out immediately for like a sideboard card, because a lot of Premodern decks are taking advantage of not playing any creatures at all. But against any matchup where you're playing against big creatures, Flametongue Kavu is just a complete house. Also like a foundational piece of the deck. It's a 2-for-1 basically at worst. So I love that card. Obviously it's very strong. It finds a really great home here in this survival deck because you can get one every single turn with Squee, and that's a lot to overcome for certain decks. That'll end the game very quickly. You don't need blockers if you can just like shoot their creatures down with a Flametongue Kavu. The Ghitu Slinger is kind of like a weaker Flametongue Kavu, and it's just there because it costs 1 less, and if it's doing the same job that turn and you have a survival with like a Squee engine going, you often want to go 1 mana deeper to put like a Squee in the graveyard and then get a Slinger, and it sets you up sometimes to I don't know, like sometimes Ghitu Slinger is the only thing you can afford to get with survival. You only have 3 mana to kill their mana dork or whatever. And so you absolutely need this card in the main deck. You might say that you would rather have Goblin Sharpshooter in the main deck, but I disagree. I think Sharpshooter is a more narrow card, and I think it's very bad in certain matchups where Ghitu Slinger is amazing in them. Anything with Meddling Mage, anything with Dauthi Slayer, like you're going to be very happy to have Ghitu Slinger in this format main deck over the Goblin Sharpshooter. I promise you that. You can even like Ghitu Slinger your own Wall of Roots if you don't have a target. It's a 2/2 for 3. Yeah, sometimes that's bad, but I really think you need this card in the main deck. Moving right along to Deranged Hermit at 3x. Now, this card is very fast at ending the game with Gaea's Cradle. You get to 5, you play a Hermit, and tap Cradle and just go absolutely wild if you have that option. Only 3, I think 4 would be a bit redundant. You can always go and get multiples with Survival, and they're going to be having Haste with the Mountain in play and Anger. So you play a Hermit and you attack for 9 immediately, on top of whatever else you have. So definitely like a core piece and engine card of the deck. You'll see this card in Survival Elves too. Like they take very good advantage of it, and we take just as good advantage in our deck of Deranged Hermit as they do in Elves. Almost even better if you consider the fact that we have Rootwallas to like make our Hermits easy to cast. So that's like sort of the broken way this deck is going to win. Is going to get a Hermit. You're just going to bash them for a lot of damage. So moving to Ravenous Bailoth. Bailoth is like the perfect card for a survival deck because it is individually powerful enough to win. It's a 4/4 for 4. That's a very strong body and at a good cost. But it also is a card that you can fetch and keep you in the game if you are playing against a burn deck and you have no other option. It's debatable that the Spike Feeder should be main deck over the Ravenous Bailoth. Just because it costs 1 less, it might be like more available, but I think that Ravenous Bailoth is better against like the blue-white control matchup, so much more so than Spike Feeder. Bailoth is individually, 2 power better and much better at attacking and blocking than Spike Feeder ever could be. So individually, I feel like you have to put Bailoth in the main deck, but I do think you want a Spike Feeder in the side deck just so you can have 2 life gain creatures against something like Burn or Sly. So the next card is Masticore. Masticore, I think, is kind of maybe a little out of place here. Because we already have Flametongue Kavu and Ghitu Slinger, we have other options for dealing with creatures, but he is pretty strong against things like Elves, and I've still never played against Elves, and I wouldn't want to run up against a spot where I couldn't go get a Masticore with all of my mana, So I'm keeping him in the main deck. Krosan Tusker is like my favorite card in the deck. It's so good. It's a 6/5 for 7, which is pretty bad, but it's a big body, so if you draw it later on, like, it can matter. Like, it can win a game. You can tap it for 3 to fetch the Mountain and draw a card. So it's kind of like a Yavimaya Granger, but it also draws you a card. They can't counter it because it's cycling. So I have not been disappointed in the slightest with Krosan Tusker. I have not missed it for a Yavimaya Granger once, and I could never go back. It's very good in this deck. Moving to the 1 Sylvan Library, this is a card that was very good in the control matchups that I was testing against. It just keeps you in the game. If you have a shuffle effect, you can use your life total to draw extra cards in the matchup where it doesn't matter, which is a lot of matchups in Premodern. It's basically survival number 5 for a card advantage standpoint, and it's not a bad card with survival. If you're activating survival, you're shuffling your library, and then you get to see a top 3 that's very fresh. Maybe you get to search for like a Seal of Cleansing that you wouldn't have found. There's so many applications for Sylvan Library, but I only play it as a one-of. So I'm going to go back up to the Monk Idealist. The Monk Idealist up here, this is like probably the best card to recover from discard spells or counter spells on your survival. So let's say your opponent casts Duress on you. Well, on your turn 2 or 3, you could play Monk Idealist and buy it back. If they counter it, you can, replay it. Let's say you play a survival and they cast Disenchant. Well, you can, in response, activate survival and survival for Monk Idealist. Your survival dies, you untap and buy it back. Having an instant speed option to recur your survival, very important.
Andy Culpepper said very impressive.
Oops.
Sweet list. Unlike any survival deck I've seen before in the format.
This guy's giving me props. But I'm going to mute this channel for 15 minutes. Where was I? Back to Monk Idealist. It has a very good synergy with Seal of Cleansing, which is also a very good card in this format. The reason why I'm able to play 2 Monk Idealists in the main deck is because it has that latent, innate synergy with Seal of Cleansing. If I'm playing against, let's say, a deck that would never counter or discard my survival, or ever be able to activate, interact with survival, Monk Idealist is still not a dead card in those situations, because I will have Seal of Cleansing to buy back with it, possibly generating a lot of value. In general, you don't want to play some cards in the main deck that are completely dead in certain matchups. Like Monk Idealist is not dead against Burn or Sly. You can play Seal of Cleansing and buy it back. Yeah, it's not great, but you can also survival the card out. I haven't been sad of having 2 Monk Idealists in the main deck. I haven't been disappointed with having 2X. I think it's very good. I wouldn't change that, but you could theoretically play only one of them. But I think it's an all-star in this deck because you're playing against so many counterspells in this format, and your survivals are so important that sticking one and getting one on the board is all you really need to care about. So, being able to recur it is, I think, really strong and valuable. So, Enlightened Tutor at 2x. This is basically survival 5 through 6 because you can always go and fetch it. Even if you're behind, if you're facing against an artifact or enchantment that you have no answers for, you can Enlightened Tutor for a Seal of Cleansing. I actually have once Enlightened Tutored for a Sylvan Library and, used that to bait out a counter for survival. That was one time. Enlightened Tutor is very good. It's very good against something like Duress. You could play a Brushland turn 1, and in response to a discard spell, you can cast Enlightened Tutor. That actually happened in a match that I just played in the pod. My opponent cast Duress. He actually had a Wasteland open. He didn't Wasteland my Brushland. He cast Duress on me, and I had 1 card, and I cast Enlightened Tutor. And he looked, kind of disappointed because I then, fetched the survival and went off. Enlightened Tutor is very good. Without any draw in this deck, we need more ways to find Survival of the Fittest. It's a very pivotal card for our strategy, and for 1 mana and 1 white, you can play it off of a Birds of Paradise. You could, play a Forest Birds of Paradise, untap during your upkeep, Enlightened Tutor, draw Survival and play it. That's a very strong line of play and a very common line of play. So that's kind of why Enlightened Tutor's here, and why white is probably strong enough to pair with the survival deck. Moving to the mana base, I think that's everything. Okay, so we have Uktabi Orangutan. I didn't talk about that. This is my only silver bullet piece in the main deck that is a trinket toolbox piece that doesn't have a good application in games without survival. How do I explain this? Uktabi's a weak card overall. It's a 2/2 for 3. Destroys an artifact. You need it in the main deck. Sometimes it's absolutely sensational. And there have been times where just playing it naturally has been a bomb. You kill a Mox Diamond, and your opponent's like, oh my god. It can be very good. Uktabi, you could never cut it. but I don't play like a main deck enchantment removal spell, or an enchantment removal creature, rather. I only play the 1 Uktabi, and I'm playing 2 Seal of Cleansing for like my only answer to things like Oath of Druids, for example. I can only kill artifacts in the main deck. Something to consider, like when you're looking at this, like some people would probably play a Monk Realist, but I would rather have the second Monk Idealist, because that's better in more matchups and in more situations, like where, like, you know, you've reached a stalemate or something with your opponent, like late game stuff. Okay? So I shouldn't have to explain Anger. Anger is like the foundation piece of this deck. The fact that you can like play all of your creatures with haste for like no cost to yourself. You can fetch Mountain immediately with the 4 Wooded Foothills, and you probably always almost should, unless you have some other thing in your hand like a Krosan Tusker, and you know you can fetch the Mountain later. Or you need the green mana for survival activations. You don't want to fetch the Mountain too early because you can't use it in synergy with survival. So you kind of want to wait, if you can, on your Foothills cracks, if you can. It's also good to have a shuffle effect with Foothills and Sylvan Library. It lets you reset the top of your library, so you know, hold the fetch lands if you can. Squee, it generates all of the value through survival. So you'll fetch Squee early on in your survival chain, put it in the yard, and then every turn you'll fetch like a free creature with it. Now, it doesn't synergize especially well with Rootwalla. You want to go in Rootwalla after Rootwalla. You don't want to play like Survival out Squee to get a Rootwalla, and then Survival out Rootwalla, and then like return Squee. It's just a bit like slower. You can do all sorts of chains like that, but you want to consider like what's the fastest way for you to go off. And sometimes Squee should just fetch like a Flametongue Kavu and answer something, rather than trying to like go aggressive immediately. Like Squee's an attrition card. It doesn't really help you go faster. It just helps you like stay in the game and have a steady stream of creatures to survival out. But it's not as good as Rootwalla. Like survivaling out Rootwalla is much better than survivaling out Squee, because it comes right into play. And you know, Lizard Gang. Okay, so that's all the creatures. That's the top main deck. I'm playing 20 lands, 3 Gaia's Cradle, 2 City of Brass that are kind of hiding back there. The 2 City of Brass are very important, because if you're going to play Enlightened Tutor, you can't just have no way to cast it outside of a Brushland or a Birds of Paradise, because Birds of Paradise dies all the time, and you can't always have a Brushland. So you need to have some other way to play, you know, Enlightened Tutor and Seal of Cleansing and Monk Idealist. So 2 City of Brass, 6 Forests, the single Mountain, and some sideboard cards. Tormod's Crypt for like Reanimator, graveyard decks. Goblin Sharpshooter for Goblins and Elves. Pyroblast for the blue decks, because there's a lot of them. You're going to run it up against counterspells a lot. And Pyroblast is exactly what you would want against the survival deck. Against the blue decks, right? They're going to hold open mana to counter your survival. You're just going to have a Pyroblast for their counterspell. And you're going to force through survival. That's how you're going to beat it. That's kind of the whole point of the deck, is to play Pyroblast against blue. Compost against black. There's a lot of black in the format. There's like fast black decks. There's slow black decks. A lot of people are playing things like Bottomless Pit, and if you have a Compost in play, you're going to have a hard time losing if you can keep your life total high. So Compost is there for, you know, just, I think, a substantial enough portion of the metagame to warrant it. Okay, so 3 Swords to Plowshares. How to explain these 3 Swords to Plowshares? Well, there are matchups where Seal of Cleansing is very bad, okay? Think Goblins, think Sly. Like, you don't want Seal of Cleansing against those matchups. And Seal of Cleansing comes out really nicely for Swords to Plowshares. So does Monk Idealist, right? If I'm playing against Survival Elves, I don't want Monk Idealist, because they're never going to, you know, be able to target my survival with anything. So I'll take all of those cards out for Swords to Plowshares and have another hard removal option that they have not seen from a rogue deck. You know, like Swords to Plowshares can come out of nowhere against like certain strategies where they're like, wow, you have a plow, you know? So it's very important to have this card in the side deck, because we have certain main deck cards that are weak in certain matchups that are always coming out. And you need to have things to bring in for potentially dead cards, and Plow does a very good job of that. So the Spike Feeder I kind of already talked about with Ravenous Bailoth. It's the 3 mana life gain card. It also gains 4. It's invaluable against Burn and Sly. You're going to want it for sure in your side deck. So 2 Collar of the Claw. I found room for a second, and I do not regret it, because if you open a hand with Collar of the Claw against a Wrath of God deck, a lot of times you can win. Like, you're gonna win. You know, like, you kind of like, you mention, oh god, if you have a Wrath of God, I'm gonna lose. They Wrath you and you Collar of the Claw, and like, it's almost always GG. Like, you don't want to be too much of a jerk about it, but Collar of the Claw is really good in this format. We're playing a lot of creatures that are going to get swept up, and being able to survival in response to a Wrath of God to get Collar, very strong play. And the last card in the sideboard is Genesis. This card is kind of debatable, but I really like it against something like even Sly, where all I need to do is gain 4 life a turn. So if I can just get a Genesis in the graveyard and buy back Spike Feeder and have 6 mana, I'm not going to lose. You know, Genesis is really also good against control decks, where maybe they're going to Crypt you, and then you can go get Genesis after that, and still have a way to, you know, really put up a fight in the later phases of the game, where if they only have 4 Swords to Plowshares, you know, they can only Wrath you so many times. Genesis gives you a sort of inevitability that is pretty good with things like Deranged Hermit and Blastoderm. So, hey guys, this is a pretty long video. Hope you guys enjoyed my walkthrough deck tech. Any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. Love to get back to all of you. Stay safe out there, and peace.